Being a parent is a full-time job, and the job description changes very quickly. It's usually best done as a partnership, a tag team, even if it is to play good cop and bad cop. But sometimes this does not work out, and a parent can find themselves alone. It's been said that the hardest job in the world is being a parent if you're doing it alone. And there is no contesting that for a variety of reasons. I'm Alex Matthew, and this is Big Decisions. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the things that a single parent can do to ensure their financial lives are taken care of. Joining me today is Vishal Dhawan, the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Plan Ahead Wealth Advisors. Thanks so much, Vishal, for taking the time.
Thank you.
It's an unfortunate situation that sometimes people find themselves in, but it does not necessarily have to be all bad. At least certain aspects can be taken care of. But I'm curious, because you interact with so many people on a daily basis, you advise them about their finances. Have you interacted with single parents?
Yes, it is. It is something that's becoming more common, and I think there are societal shifts taking place, which are making it different from how it used to be. But clearly, there is a lot more happening today around single parenting than it used to. Some out of choice, some out of decisions that unfortunately didn't work out in the way that they were meant to work out. And we are therefore seeing, divorces, widowhood. We're seeing people just choosing to be single parents. So the plethora of ways in which single parenting is getting created has increased. And we are also seeing that the pressure of managing financial lives of kids as a single parent is something that weighs on single parents very significantly, because they sort of take that on as a responsibility which they don't necessarily enjoy. And frankly, it's not that much harder. But I think it needs a very systematic approach in terms of how one has to do it.
So at least from the financial standpoint, it can be managed. What you're saying is
Yes.
that, because I would imagine that the emotional drain of being a single parent would be substantial. Absolutely. And we're trying to fix one aspect that should be manageable, as what if that's what you're saying. Let's talk about some of the key aspects here, though, because what are the first things that you think of? How am I going to manage this? And usually I'm talking about individuals that don't have access to a large amount of money, and therefore their finances are completely dependent on one paycheck now. What's the first thing that you need to do if you find yourself in a situation like this?
So I think the first case is just to accept that this is the reality. I think acceptance very often then makes you find the solution. What we find is two particular trends that seem to play out very commonly in single parenting. One is the emotional hardness of the process makes single parents far more conservative than they should be by default. So without having done the numbers, without having looked at every financial goal that they want to achieve, very often they're thinking conservative by default. Which may or may not be the right approach. I think it's very good to be conservative if the numbers demand it.
Right.
But if the intent of being conservative is simply coming from being a single parent, then I think that may need a little bit of a think around it.
But conservative in what manner?
So conservative in very, very many ways, right? So the way that, the best way demonstration of conservatism normally comes from the way that you spend. And spending it's great to have your expenses under control, but very often if you tighten up too much between the lifestyle that you had versus the lifestyle that you're now trying to create, you can actually create a lot of distress, both for yourself as well as for the child. And therefore trying to find the balance between what is a real set of expenses that I should have versus what I had maybe a few months ago needs to be brought to the table. So the starting point in our view is always to get down to budgeting right. I think you have to get down to saying that, what is it that I would be able to potentially spend on fixed expenses. There's no discretion around it. I just need to do that. And the second is discretionary expenses. So, for example, if you were not a single parent, you may have chosen to work very far away from where you live, and you could have schooling also at a fair distance from both of these places. Maybe as a single parent, you have to make certain choices to move close to your workplace. Maybe you need to make certain choices to change the kind of school that your child has to go to. So I think it's important to budget right and say that, okay, these to me are non-compromisable fixed expenses, and these are discretionary expenses which I will, I obviously like to do discretionary expenses, but maybe I need to be a little mindful of which of these is discretionary and which is not.
Let's talk about discretionary expenses, but I want to nail down some of these big heads, right, which needs to be discussed so that somebody in this situation can figure something out very quickly. When you say budgeting, would you say it's something like if you are living in a house on which there's an ongoing EMI, and quite often these are shared between the partners, and you're suddenly ending up paying the EMI yourself, what do you do in that situation if you can't afford it? And apart from housing, what are the other heads that you would say are very important to focus on, both discretionary and non-discretionary?
So I think one of the important things that one needs to do and be very mindful of as a single parent making these decisions is that you have to find the numbers from a very holistic view. Because when you change houses, for example, because you think you can't afford the EMI, you do understand that this is actual disruption in the way that you've lived beyond just the parenting style or the fact that there were two parents at one point. So one needs to find the balance between whether the reason to move is just coming from actually not having enough resources or just because you're being too conservative. But having said that, if the numbers do show that that needs to happen, it needs to happen. And I think the important part about this is to have the conversation with your child or children, explaining why you are making certain decisions. And the fact that, as things change, some of this will also probably evolve. So besides housing, which obviously tends to be a very large component, there can be 2 or 3 other large fixed expenses that need to get taken care of. One is the support systems that you need to build around being a single parent. So whether it is domestic help, whether it is possibly a driver that you need to be able to, ferry your children around, whether it's, trusted nannies or housekeepers. I mean, those are all very, very important elements because they'll allow you to continue to work and have a career which is essentially your sort of golden goose, if you may call it, and ensure that expenses are managed. So one is that segment. The second segment is around utilities. And what can end up happening again is that we don't realize this, but we could actually, when you put all your utilities together, electricity, telephone bills, OTT subscriptions, etc., you could actually be running up fairly large numbers of money with an ability to actually cut down quite meaningfully if you spend time thinking about it very carefully. And the third big sort of expense tends to come from where you will actually deal with as far as education is concerned, because school fee and everything ancillary to that.
It's incredibly expensive.
Ancillary to that, because you'll have maybe a bus, maybe you'll have extracurricular activities, co-curricular activities linked to the curriculum. So there's a lot of that happening as well. And a lot of children today are clearly not just going to school. They have lots of activities after that. So those are heads that you want to look at very carefully at a top level. And then when you come to discretionary, you want to think about travel, you want to think about gifting, you want to think about grooming and clothing. These are 3 big heads in there as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things that can sometimes happen is that you could end up overspending on these discretionary items because you're trying to
compensate,
make up.
Yeah.
And I think that's a dangerous model.
Okay, so while it's difficult to put percentages to these things and put thumb rules in place, I'm sure that you can provide some indicative numbers to bear in mind, because obviously the income scale is something that you have to factor in as well. But assuming that there is a single income, and quite often, we haven't mentioned it so far, family is there to support you in certain situations, so some aspects get taken care of there. But when it comes to income and when it comes to certain thumb rules, for a couple, you often say not more than 50% of your cumulative income should go towards EMIs. There are certain things to bear in mind. Is there a formula that is easy to understand?
Yeah, so in all probability, you don't want your EMIs to go beyond 30% of your net income as an individual single parent. And you want to simultaneously buffer that with ensuring that you have a much larger emergency fund.
Right.
Because in theory, if you lost your job, for whatever reason, you don't want a situation where that pressure of the loans now gets to you completely. So if you typically hear about rules which are 3 to 6 months of contingency or emergency funds, including EMIs for double income families, I think for a single parent, that number needs to be anywhere between 12 months to 18 months to be able to buffer for this, because we do understand that what you don't want to do necessarily is just take the next job that comes to you, because the pressure of the expense is getting to you.
Yeah. When it comes to this aspect and the safety net, of course, insurance is terribly important, particularly for a single parent. Term insurance is what we generally speak of. I would hope that you would agree with me. And so from that perspective, how soon should you get it? Should you have gotten it yesterday?
Yes. So I think, a lot of this, of course, needs to come through basis the resources that you have. Because essentially, what is insurance, right? Insurance is trying to plug a gap between the assets you have today versus what is it that you would require in case something happened to you, and therefore you need to take care of the children's or child's expenses plus the future goals like education, marriage, etc. So once you're able to mathematically come to that answer, one of the things that we don't like to suggest is, buy insurance for big fat round numbers.
Yeah.
But once you've done the math, I think it's really important that you have that going really quickly. There is a tendency very often for parents, especially single parents, to defer that decision, saying, I think this is just a cost. And, if nothing happens to me, it's wasted, especially when you're buying term insurance. But you need to be mindful is that the risk that gets passed on in case you don't have it is disproportionately large as a single parent as compared to, having someone else as a partner. Additionally, it's not just term insurance, but even things like health insurance becomes so much more critical when you're a single parent, because maybe your finances cannot support a large outflow that happens because of health reasons. So our suggestion to single parents is look at a health insurance cover independent of what your company provides you. In addition to that, look at a critical illness cover, because we think that these are two things that anyone who's in a single parenting mode, besides the term life insurance, need to have in their basket.
Key risks to cover.
Absolutely.
So, but there's also investments to take care of. And you mentioned at the start that the tendency is to become very conservative. I think that would be true with regard to investments as well. How should you ideally go about it? And you said that you've also interacted with single parents. There are situations where there is a split. Oftentimes, investments are not made proportionately, and they're not shared between husband and wife or partners. And as a result of which, there is acrimony when the split takes place. The distribution of assets is not necessarily equitable. How do you go about that kind of a scenario?
So I think, the starting point to any of this is always to be clearly, far more involved with money matters. As much as, when you have a partner, to be sort of delegating responsibilities to each other. We clearly believe that financial matters, even if one doesn't have to go down to the last rupee, needs to be talked about always as a couple. But having said that, maybe that part of your life is behind you. It didn't happen, right? And therefore, you now have either money coming in through some sort of support coming from your earlier partner, or you have a corpus that has come to you or you've been left literally high and dry, and there is nothing that you have at all except for the income that will come in. Now, clearly, depending on how how you've been sort of handed this situation, you may have to do things differently. Clearly, the worst situation to be in is now be completely dependent on your income, and therefore the tendency is to be conservative naturally, because first of all, you're going to a space which you may not have ever spent time on, and it's uncomfortable. And the second is the added responsibility of saying that I have to make these decisions for myself and for my child or children, adds even more pressure. So one of the best ways to deal with this is literally to build your goals out or your milestones out, saying that, okay, what are my requirements of money over shorter periods of time? When I define short term here, I'm talking about anything coming up in the next 3 years. What is it that I think I'll require in the medium term, which could be anywhere between 3 years to 10 years? And what is it that I require over long periods of time, which is 10 years plus? Now, the moment you start building out your life, thinking about in this way, not only does it help your finances, but it also helps you think about your life a little bit more.
You get clarity.
You get clarity because you now start to say that, oh, you know what? These are the kind of things that I want to do. Now, what you want to do is when you're starting off, you want to ensure that that short-term bucket is well protected. But you also want to be sure that you don't want to leave the medium term and the long term out to the future. Because the problem could be that you could always then be thinking short term over the next 2-3 years, and you miss the entire opportunity.
You're living paycheck to paycheck.
Absolutely.
So how do you then, and overall there is going to be, and so obviously the thumb rule is that you look at short term and you say that you're not going to put too much money into equity there because it's something that you have to achieve. For the long term and the medium term, which is more than 5 years, you look at equity. But then the tendency, of course, at the corpus level is to say that, look, I can't take the risk of equity. There is a fear that if I lose all my money, what am I going to do? What would you say about the advice that you can dispense here to ensure that you have enough money in long-term assets?
So I think the important part is to remember that your responsibility is towards two people, towards your child and towards yourself. It's not a single responsibility that comes with being a single parent. The moment you've figured that out, you now have to take a bucket approach and say that, okay, for the next 3 years, whatever I need to save, I'm going to put into assets which are potentially, short-term assets. So you use instruments like deposits, you use debt mutual funds, you may use arbitrage funds, you may use other instruments. A lot of this also depends on taxation for you. And that could vary depending on your income. You then start to move to the medium term and the long term bucket and start to allocate monies to asset classes that, again, you may not be familiar with, but you have data around long periods of time to understand how they work. And you start to allocate the money there, saying, okay, so in this bucket, which is medium term, I will try to use a mix of
combination
different
of
types of
equity
assets.
and debt.
And then you move to the third bucket where you can say, I can have really long-term assets. But a very important thing to keep in mind is liquidity of the assets that you choose become very paramount as a single parent. So if you have a choice between, let's say, buying equity which is going to lock in your money versus equity which is not going to lock in your money, make the choice to buy the equity which is not going to lock in your money, because situations can change so significantly as a single parent that you don't want your money to be locked in at all.
What about involving your children? And you said right at the start, and I think that is great advice, to involve your children in decisions that you're making. When it comes to the investments that you're making, is it a good idea to have a joint account with your child or your children at that moment itself, to have joint accounts in terms of the savings bank accounts that you have right at that start, rather than handing it down later?
So there are two things around involving children. One is, of course, the operational part of it, which is, for example, a minor account is always opened under a guardian. And therefore, as the guardian now, there would be a minor account. You need to be a little mindful of the fact that when a minor becomes major, which is essentially when your child turns 18, he or she now becomes the decision maker on that account. And therefore, you want to expose the child to how money works, create that financial literacy, but at the same time, you don't want to, at 18, give him
Give
or
them
her
full
a
liberty.
large amount of money,
Yeah.
because they may not have the maturity to deal with it. And this has nothing to do with you being a single parent or not.
Right.
It's just that children are probably not
Equipped.
enough at 18 to take big decisions with big money.
Hmm.
And therefore, it's important to look at it differently and say that I'm using that as a learning ground for them without giving them too much of it. More importantly, it's important to have open conversations on why certain decisions are being made in a certain way.
But
For
what
example,
about,
Yes,
sorry,
yes,
for
yes.
example?
So, for example, education, right? So, aspirationally, your kids could be thinking that I want to study overseas because a lot of my friends are talking that language already, or they have, friends whose siblings have actually gone to study overseas, and they're wondering whether we can go there or not. And by not being transparent, the child is not any clearer on whether he can do it or not.
You're not setting
You're
the
not setting the
expectations.
expectations right. Now, the fact is that the child can go, provided he starts to work towards it.
Scholarships
and
are
therefore
important.
scholarships, or taking a loan. Some of these things can be solutions to make it happen. Or maybe it's not a undergraduate education, but it's a postgraduate education. So I think by bringing up those conversations, as uncomfortable as they may be, I think you start to get the child involved in the decision because he understands the why behind it, rather than sort of handing it down as a decision that has been taken.
I was curious about, so when you said a minor account, I assume it has to do with a bank account.
Yes.
But then if you're talking about a demat account, or if you're talking about investments made through mutual funds, through the folio, can you have a joint holder as your kids?
So again, it works in the same manner, where the minor actually, ideally the account is in the name of the minor, in the investment account as well, and you have a guardian on top of
Right.
that. And,
But you can't make a joint account holder.
No, you can't have a joint account holder there. But essentially what you end up doing there is that you are taking decisions on behalf of the minor, as long as the child is a minor. Beyond a point, the moment the minor turns major, he will get a PAN card by himself. All those accounts will temporarily get frozen till they get converted from minor to major, and then he starts making the decision.
Okay, when it comes to handing over assets, and this is an important factor also to bear in mind, and you think about this, I would think, much earlier than other people do, because you want to ensure that everything's taken care of. As a single parent, what do you need to bear in mind, and how soon should you get down to, I think we've spoken about this on various fora, writing a will is extremely important. It becomes even more so. But how soon should this be done?
So this is really yesterday, right? Because I think the situation of moving from a single parent to a child having no parent is a very, very hard thing to do. And we need to keep in mind two things around this. One is guardianship, and one is asset transfer. These are two separate roles that need to get played. The guardian is essentially going to take care of the day-to-day needs of your child. Maybe it's a medical emergency, maybe it is a situation where you have to decide which subject to choose in school. Maybe it's it's just daily living. So identifying who that guardian is and actually putting that out in a document.
Speaking to the guardian.
And speaking to the guardian and telling them that you're giving them this role. And are they willing to take on this role? Because you don't want to thrust it upon someone who's not ready as well, because then it would be a challenging one to take
There's
care
a
of.
legal document.
So there is, in your will itself, you could actually make this happen. Or you could decide that you want this to be more formalized by creating a trust, which could come into existence maybe only if you don't actually be there as a parent at all.
Yeah.
So the way we look at it is, one part is identifying the guardian, speaking to him or her, etc. The second part is dealing with the financial assets. One of the things that we clearly believe is that even if your child becomes 18 and a major, he can't handle large sums of money. And therefore, there will be a need to think about things like trust to get created at some point in time, so that the trustees of that trust, who could be the guardians as well, or who could be other people, are actually out there ensuring that their needs are taken care of the child, whether it is daily living needs, whether it's medical expenses, education, marriages, etc., or whether it is just a situation where there is actually um,
Clarity.
views on what's right and what's wrong. So by having a trust, very often as a single parent, you have actually set out instructions to people
Yeah, so
in
there's
terms of how
clarity.
you want to deal with that situation.
Is it complicated though?
It's not very complicated. I think you need to understand that sometimes you need to do something a little more than what you would have normally done, because there's no natural backup plan which would have normally been there as having a partner. And this is the way that you safeguard that the way that your child is taken care of is actually appropriate. I think it does create a little bit of extra operational work when it gets created, because the trust is like a separate entity. It will have a PAN card by itself. If it has income in it, it has to file a tax return. So a lot of that operational stuff will come in. But the way to think about it is that this is my best way to build a plan B, because no parent is really not just 2 times harder than single parent, but it's probably many, many more times harder.
Yeah.
And what you don't want is, money to be a challenge.
We
there.
have spoken about extreme cases, but there are also cases, and some would say the ideal scenario where there is the decision that you have not been able to reconcile differences and you are going to be living separately as a couple, but you decide to co-parent. And so each parent would want to be involved as far as possible and share responsibilities. From a financial standpoint, do you think that that's the ideal scenario?
It's very, very useful, because what happens is that it does get hard with a single income to meet the aspirations of all other goals as well. Because again, what we need to remember is that if you were a couple, you would have had a common retirement. And therefore the amount of money that you would have needed maybe for your retirement kitty would have been lower, because you didn't have to actually, your expenses don't double because you're a couple.
Yes.
Just like they don't half because you're single. So some of that kitty which would have, sort of needs extra push, now needs to come from hopefully co-parenting, where some of those things can be taken care of. And there are elegant solutions that we've seen couples arrive at. For example, there are, there's a parent who could say that, I will do everything around education.
Okay.
And that becomes now an efficient solution, because as a single parent, education is very important for most people. And
as an expense.
Not just as an expense, but just something that they aspire for their children.
Yes.
And both parents could have the same aspiration. And the fact that money has become a constraint is not something that a parent wants to deal with, and says that, so one of the parents takes on the responsibility, saying that this is what I'm willing to support. So all the education requirements I will take care of. Everything else you need to take care of.
etc., etc.
So then what it does is it takes one big burden off the head of actually both the parents, because the one parent who's supporting it is happy that the education's happening in the way that he or she would have liked it. The other parent is now saying that I need to focus on just one other aspect of it, which is coming here. And I think it really reduces burdens. I think the important part to keep in mind though is that some of this may get complex if there is another partner that happens sometime in the future. And therefore one needs to be mindful of that life can change. And therefore one needs to be mindful of the fact that as life changes, your financial plan and your financial goals also need to adapt to that change. So it needs to get revisited at least every couple of years, if not every year, to see that you're on
or
track.
whenever there's a major shift in the scenario.
Yes, absolutely.
I think we've covered a lot of bases. Vishal, thank you so much for joining in and for taking the time for speaking to us on Big Decisions.
Pleasure.
It wasn't the easiest conversation, and it's not the easiest situation to be in, but hopefully this conversation and the advice that Vishal dispensed is going to help you navigate what would ordinarily have been harder to do. Do stay tuned, lots more coming up over the course of the day, and this is NDTV Profit.